why does story structure even matter?
I mean, the why is, well, before we get into it.
What's up, Story Geeks? I'm Jay Sherer, and on today's video, we're going to dig deeper into story structure with my special guest, Caleb Monroe. We're going to talk about why story structure matters, how you can do it, and some of the tools and resources available to you that might help out. Please click that like button for me, and if you've got questions, leave them down below as you watch the video, and I'll be sure to follow up with you. Links to some of the tools and resources that we recommend are in the description down below. Let's dig deeper into story structure.
Why does story structure even matter? Like, why should we be paying attention to story structure?
I mean, the why is, well, before we get into it, let me give you a little caveat. I'm going to slightly modify a quote by Michel de Montaigne for in his essay Of Practice,
Nice.
1580s. But what I say here is not my teaching, but my study. It's not a lesson. It's not a lesson for others, but it's for me. And yet it should not be held against me if I share what I'm studying. What is useful to me may also by accident be useful to others. I want to say that up at the beginning because I'm not an expert. I mean, I have been paid to write things, but all the best writers I know, even up into their 60s, 70s, 80s, they still consider themselves students. And that's the approach. I consider myself a student. And if you ask me these same questions a year from now, my answers will probably have evolved. And I'll probably think some things I said today were stupid then, you know? So I just want to say, like, because there's this whole sort of like writing advice industrial complex where a lot of people who don't know what it is to be a writer give a lot of people who want to be writers, quote unquote, advice so that they can make a living. And so I just want to say I don't have answers. I'm just probably have thought about some of these questions more than most people.
Right. Yeah. And actually, that's perfect because this YouTube channel is all about the way we approach the channel is that we say we're learning how to write and produce our own original stories. So therefore, every time we come to a thought process about something or we test something and learn from it, we're just going to let you know what happened. Like this is our learning from this experience. And so it's very practical. It's a way that an entrepreneur would teach something, not in a way that an academic would teach it. Like we might get the academic part of it way wrong, but this is just what we're experiencing and what we're playing with and what we're hearing back from our audience when we do these stories. So that's perfect. That's exactly the kind of framework.
Excellent. I like to say that because the way I talk about things, even if I'm not convinced about them, is I say them very definitively because it's because I'm testing them out. So I'm just giving everyone permission right now that if I say something definitively and it does not make sense to you, that's okay. It's not definitive.
Perfect. That's great.
Okay, so why are these things important? There's this equation that I like to use. I know we just lost about half the writers with the word equation, but time plus consciousness equals narrative. So a consciousness that is in time so that things happen one after another, that's all it takes for narrative. But narrative is not story. Story is shaped narrative. And so if you are going to shape a narrative, that's why all these things are important. These are shaping tools. And the reason, the closer reason why it's important to shape a narrative is if you told me what you did today at the store, that's narrative. And I am not going to remember that a decade from now. Right. But if I watch an incredible movie today, I will remember it 10 years from now. That's why shaped narrative is important, is because it becomes something that lives with you and inside you. But then even bigger than that, the reason shaped narrative is important. I have some friends. I'm actually staying with them right now. He's a composer. She's a producer. And they shared a couple stories with me. And so they had a producer friend who went to Washington. He had an hour meeting with Justice Scalia from the Supreme Court.
Wow. Okay.
And Scalia asked him, well, what do you do? And he said, I'm a producer. And he said, oh, so you're from the place where they make culture, then they bring it to us to adjudicate. and one of them was in Nashville at a conference for creatives, and the wife of another Supreme Court justice was there, Virginia Thomas, wife of Clarence Thomas, and her point was, if you give money to politics, it's too late. Give money to the arts, because that's where culture gets created.
I love that. I love that. That's great.
So storytelling is important because it shapes our culture, and our culture is important because it shapes our world. Yep. And these things usually predate politics, or so many of the other fulcrums and levers that we rely on these days. So that's why storytelling is important. Shaping storytelling is important so that it will actually stay with people and has the potential to shape culture. Yeah,
I think that's fantastic. My answer like scales it down a little bit more. So I think that you're 100% right. I think I've actually said to people before, earlier in life, I used to be a lot more political, and now I'm far more apolitical. And it's not because I don't care, it's because I care more. And getting to the stories that we all believe, getting to the heart of the matter is almost more important, because the politics is just how it ends up happening, right? Like what people decide in their hearts affects society. What society decides collectively then affects politics. So if you want to make changes, you don't change politics, like you just said, you change your heart condition. One of the things that I have written in my notes is just that compelling stories, and this is your point about narrative, right? Compelling stories, if you just take a narrative and make it compelling, it needs drama. And our brains are wired in such a way that I think that we better engage with people. We fully engage with audiences through technique, and structure is one of the elements that we can play with as we engage the audience in storytelling. And so the thought process was, just having watched Tiger King, which is completely ridiculous on Netflix. There's constant twists. It's about, you can expect a kind of like a bombshell revelation to be dropped every so often, and every single episode is going to end on a cliffhanger to the point where you're like, I gotta watch the next episode. And I think that that's all part of technique. They're structuring their story in such a way where they go, this episode's going to be about this, and we're going to transition on to the next episode here, and it's the most compelling place to get people fully engaged. So yeah, I think we're on the same page with all of that for sure. So as you think about the basic elements of story structure for people who, and I think this is true, like I totally agree with you that as we go through these things, it's a constant process of learning and relearning. And a lot of times people like technologies will start breaking the mold, right? Like think about before people could binge watch, you could tell stories and structure your stories in a different way. But now that people can binge watch, it's like a completely different like take on it. Like, well, now I can structure it differently because people can binge watch. But what are the most basic elements of story structure when you break it down?
Sure, I will. I'm going to give you a caveat at the top of this one too, which is, yes, I do write movies, but I also write comics, right. And I've been doing a lot more prose recently, and story structure does not work the same in any of those. So I'm gonna try to step back and talk about principles instead of techniques, because techniques get specific to your medium.
Love it.
So the micro side of structure, I have a friend who's a very experienced TV writer, and he says all structure is page 1 makes you want to read page 2, page 2 makes you want to read page 3, page 3 makes you want to read page 4, all the way until the story's over.
I like it.
And it's true. You know, all of these sort of charts that we draw and complex structures that we create are really just intended to create that effect that the story pulls people through and they feel satisfied at the end. So, but I think that's a less daunting way for us to think about it sometimes.
Right.
All I have to do is make sure that this page gets them to the next page.
Right.
And but sort of on a macro structure level, I've thought about this different ways over the years. At the moment, and I owe a lot of credit to writer and writing teacher Barbara Harrington for helping set me on this path. At the moment, I think in terms of moments. So what are the 1 or 2 moments in this story that people remember 10 years after they've seen it or they've read it, and then build your story around those. By the time that you've created the support that's needed for those couple of moments to have the emotional impact that you want of them, then you basically have a whole story. And when I think back on the stories that I love, like passionately love, even the ones that I've rewatched or reread a ton, I know all the scenes in and out, but when you say the name of that movie to me or that comic, one or two things are what pop to mind. Those key moments where I felt something really intense. You know, I don't remember everything that happened in Grant Morrison's entire run of JLA, but I will never forget the moment when Superman has finally met a foe that he can't fight, and he's dying, and the Justice League needs volunteers for a last-ditch effort to try to save him, and everyone on Earth volunteers because Superman has saved them so many times that the human race is willing to risk their life to try to save him. Like, that is a moment I remember. And there was, you know, there's 50-something issues in that run, and every one of them was fantastic read, but that's the one that sticks with me long, long after. Or that gut-wrenching moment in Mark Millar's Jupiter's Legacy when Walter reveals what he's really done to Grace. Or just the beauty of the last 2-page spread in Preacher. Or the moment in the novel Chokehold when Vic Ventura dies in Angel's back seat. The final scene of Babadook where you suddenly realize what you've been watching. And you know, there's this complex morning scene in the movie Doom Generation that it's the thing I think of every time I think of that movie. And it's just this bizarre little scene between these two characters, Amy and Jordan. She cheated on him the night before with a guy named Xavier, and Xavier is still asleep in the bed next to her. But then you have this scene between Amy and Jordan, and it's one of the sweetest scenes I've ever seen on film. It's just so sweet. And like, that sticks with me, that and the horrible penultimate scene at the end. But part of why it's so horrible is because the moment before it is so sweet. Or, you know, I can go on and on. Seabiscuit, when they finally let the horse run. Like, I mean, I cry. you get the idea. So these are all really great stories done by really smart writers who put a lot of work into every page and into characterization and into structure. But the way that they work in our minds is there tends to be those one or two things that just stay with you. They haunt you in a good way. And so I just want one or two of those moments in a story. Cool. And then I'll just put all the things I need around those to make them work. So that's sort of, you know, sort of a big version of how I think about story. This is how Flannery O'Connor thought about stories. A college professor once said that every creative writing student wants to be Flannery O'Connor for a period. And you can understand why. She has a very small body of work, 2 novels, 35 stories. She died very young. They made an exception to the rules of the National Book Award so they could reward one to her after she died. And like 50 years later, they did a poll in 2009. And it was chosen as the best book to have ever received the National Book Award.
Wow.
So she's this great writer. People love her work and it stays with them. But she believed every story should just be built around one moment, one key, mysterious, unexpected moment that offers grace. And sometimes the characters accept the grace and sometimes they don't. But having that transformative moment for her is why a story existed. And so it's not, so your story needs however many beats it takes to get you to that moment. And Mark Millar, who I mentioned a little earlier, he has like a layered version of this. I heard him describing his writing process recently. He said, okay, well, I start with one visual. So you can think of that. That's one moment. He's like, I just start with something that I think looks good. Then I noodle. He just noodles around on that till he gets 6 story points out of that one image, and those are going to be the 6 issues of the comic. And then once he knows he's got this 6-issue comic, or if he comes up with 5 points, it'll be a 5. You know, whatever. He knows that every 6-issue story should have 8 to 10 really good moments. So what he goes through is he just slashes room in all the stories for those moments. So he can give the amount of pages needed to those moments. And those are the things that are holding the whole story together.
I love that. I love that thought process of like, of being able to, because you know, books and books and books. In fact, I'm going to mention one have been written on how to structure your stories and what it means to structure stories. And you're right, like the techniques are different depending on the medium. Although I tend to use a similar technique in a lot of different mediums, which I'll get into. But I love the idea of moments, because I think what can happen is stories are such an emotional thing that audiences respond to. And sometimes if we focus too much on the structure of the story, we can forget that, like, if there's no moments that we're drawn to, then why are we reading it? It doesn't really matter. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And so we have two brains as a writer. We have our creative brain and we have our critical brain.
Yep.
And your critical brain writes horrible, horrible stories.
Right.
You have to turn it off and use your creative brain to write the story. And then you use your critical brain to figure out, well, what story have I written? And how does this fit in the world? And who do I sell it to? Or you know, those sort of things.
Yeah.
And also, you know, if you're the type of writer who does drafts, you bring out your critical voice, you get a sense of what you want to do, and then you have to throw your critical voice away again and do the rewriting in your creative voice. But some people, there's two types. I guess there's two types of writers in my mind. I call them the muses and the mechanics. So muses, like me, are very intuitive. It can be hard for me to write about structure. I'm glad you gave me some days to think about it, because honestly, my process is, well, I just sort of feel my way through it. That feels right to do next, and that feels right to do next. And but then there's other writers who are mechanics. Mechanics are no less creative than painters. They're using their creative mind, but it works in a different way. And so I think there are some people where outlining and creating structure for something actually is their creative voice at work, but it's a mechanical creative voice. And I think that's what you have to figure out for yourself as a writer. If I am creating an outline, a detailed outline, is my creative voice working or my critical voice working? Because you want to use the process where your creative voice is working. So for me, for muses and intuitive writers, we just write a draft. We write the story, and then we get to the end and we're like, okay, now I know what the story is about. And then you can clean it up. But we have to do, that's how our creative voice puts a story together. But then there's other writers that they actually can even be most creative during those months when they're putting the outline together.
Right.
And either way, you spend about the same time. You either write a first draft or you put together an outline. It's still going to take you roughly the same time. And then you're still going to have to do another draft after that. So it's finding sort of your personal, what works for you.
Yeah, that's totally true. I'm probably, this is why it's a good conversation to have both of us on this video, because I'm probably the other half of it. I'm probably I gravitate more towards the mechanic side of things. And so for me, and what that requires, by the way, from a difference of process, is that while you can get sort of inspiration to start writing, what will happen with me is I'll get inspiration for an idea. I'll have to think about how that idea fits into a story, not just a narrative. Break that down a little bit, start writing, realize all the areas where it's still not going to work as a story, and then go back. But I approach it still more probably from the mechanics sort of viewpoint on it. Now, let me throw three things at you and see if there's a way for you to break these.
Sure.
I would love to hear this ability to break these. But so I would say that the stories, again, not a narrative, because a narrative is just saying some things, right? Words coming out of your mouth in an order. But a story basically has like three different elements to it. That being the setup. So you're drawing the audience in with a compelling problem or a scenario of some sort. There's the conflict, determining how these characters over the course of time will address the problem that has been presented to them. And then the resolution, that being the result of the characters interacting around the problem for a certain period of time. Is there a way to break that and say, like, no, some stories don't have those three things?
There are some stories that don't have those three things, but they they're like atonal music. They you know, like atonal music serves a purpose, and it does raise certain types of questions. And doing a non-traditional narrative, I think a lot of times the reason you do that is to have your audience question the assumptions they're making about stories in the first place.
Yes.
So it's a very deconstructive approach. So I would say, yes, you can, but it's very rare. And it's even more rare for it to be done well.
Yes.
So sometimes something is atonal music just because someone doesn't know how to play the instrument. You know, like, but you know, I mean, basically, what you were saying is what I think of as beginning, middle, and end.
Yes.
And when it comes to structure, I think that's all you need is beginning, middle, and end. There, you know, some people will give you 22 points of how to get through that. Some people will say, nope, that's all you need, beginning, middle, end. Some people will give you 9 or 10 or 14 or 12 or whatever have you. But just, I mean, you really just need to think, what do I want to feel, and have, what does my character believe at the beginning? How will my feelings be different, and how will their life be different in the middle, and where does it all end up? And it's the where does it all end up that I think is the most shapy of the narrative. Like, story is shaped narrative, but part of why narrative is not a story is because it doesn't end. My life has been a continuous narrative for every day I've been alive. It would not make an interesting movie. And this is why a lot of people who have never written something, they're like, oh, I've got a great idea for a movie, and it's something that happened to them in real life. But unfortunately, all they have is a middle. There's no beginning and there's no end. And the end is the really crucial one. You have, how do you find endings in stories that don't really end, which are human lives, you know? But then also that is the final emotion that your audience leaves with. So no matter what you did for the first 90% of that story, if they leave with a bad taste in those last 10%, they will not remember it as a good story.
That's true.
If you're 90% of the story has its flaws, but the way it leaves them, they're just like, they're crying or they're laughing or they just want to watch it again immediately, then they'll remember it as a great story, regardless of its flaws. So
yeah, that's really true. We, in fact, to that point, talking about like how you practice these things to see how they work and to see how audiences will respond to them. Because again, we're getting out of the academics of like, well, how it could work into the, well, what do you actually do? And we had the one short film we've produced thus far is called Star Wars Rivals. And when I say that we produced thus far, I mean for the Reclamation Society specifically. We did a Star Wars short film, and it was about the concept of bullying and what can result when bullying occurs in a situation. And it was me applying a situation that I had experienced and then trying to create a story and a narrative around that specific experience. And it's so funny because it ends the way we intended it to end, because it ends in a way that is a non-traditional, it's much more of a short film type of ending where you're left with kind of like a question at the end as opposed to a resolution. And every time we screen it for people, they get to the end and they go, oh, that's it. And then they don't know what to do. And it's like they want to clap because they're like, they were engaged. And then, like, you know, all of the YouTube comments are basically like, well, now I need a sequel. Now I need a sequel. And what we actually did that intentionally, because what we wanted to do was we wanted to say, we're going to create a film that's anti-bullying, but actually we're not going to make you, it's not a PSA. You're not going to feel great at the end of this film. You're going to feel like, oh yeah, bullying sucks. And this is, you know, kind of like that. But we're playing with some of the traditional understanding of how that story would be resolved. And so I think that's a really good point, is that like you can play with a lot of this stuff and then people will have very different reactions to it.
And sometimes those are the haunting moments. Sometimes you watch a movie and there's a scene in it, you feel like, you know what, I don't think that it was Terrence Malick. I think there's actually something happening in that scene and I don't get it yet. And so your mind keeps returning to it over and over again. So sometimes the haunting moment is one that you just haven't quite figured out. You're like, I know something important. I know something important is going on, and it's causing things inside of me, but I couldn't tell you what is happening. You know?
Yeah.
And sometimes you do that by accident, and sometimes you do that. Sometimes you do that intentionally. But that actually describes the whole writing process. Sometimes you do something brilliant by accident. More often than not, you do something brilliant by accident.
Right.
You do something really dumb intentionally.
Oh, 100%. So as we get to your process, you talked about this a little bit, because you talked about, you have like kind of the muse that goes in, and you try and filter the story through that and try to write one page at a time. I love that. Are there any other elements of structure that you've used in the past that you use today when you go back over it another time to try and say, like, am I adhering to some things? Are there any of that, or are you pretty much free with it?
I'm not particularly worried about, how many pages Act 1 is, or if the midpoint is actually at the midpoint, or 5 or 10 pages to either side of it, or any of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Because what I have learned is, if you write a story and it's engaging, the beginning, the middle, and the end will take roughly the same shape, and that's what everyone is trying to get at with their diagrams. The thing is
Mm-hmm.
diagrams don't help you do it. Diagrams are dissecting it afterwards. It's dissecting the frog, but it doesn't tell you anything about how to make a frog. Making a frog is very different than cutting it apart and seeing the pieces it has. And so, so my process has been me learning, well, how do I get some of that key stuff that I know I'm going to need later? I've learned after writing story after story, I'm going to get to, at some point, I'm like, oh, you know what? I forgot to, or whatever.
Right. Right.
So how do I get at least a list of those crucial things? Because that's how I outline, is a list. I get a single yellow sheet of paper, legal pad.
Nice.
And I just number it down the side. There's 37 lines on a college ruled yellow legal pad. And that's really all you need as far as story beats. That's a whole movie. That's a whole novel. That's 37 chapters in a novel. In a movie, that's 37 2 to 3 page scenes, and in a comic, it's going to be even shorter. It's going to be 20. It's going to be 1 through 20, and that's a page for each page of the issue.
Yeah.
And that's how I started outlining for comics. I would just go 1 through, comics were 22 pages when I started, 1 through 22, and I'd write 1 to 3 words just to describe what happens on that page.
Oh, that's awesome.
And just so I had a sense of, like, okay, these 3 pages are going to be action. I have to make sure the action is ready to happen by the time I get into this page, and all that sort of stuff. And that's still really my process. But I have learned that obviously for longer stories, to have the kind of cohesiveness that you want, sometimes it helps to have a slightly richer list. So I still start that way. I think, what are the key moments I want? What are the visual, based on this concept that I have, what would be the coolest things that could happen? What would be those visuals that I would just kick myself if I missed? And what are those emotional moments that I want people to feel? And a lot of times those are the same, the visual and, and the coolness and the emotion. Often they intersect. And so I figure out, what are those? What are the big moments? And then I have a series of questions that I ask myself just to make sure I'm not missing something crucial. So the questions are things like, how is each character introduced? Do they need a scene of their own, or are they getting introduced in a scene you already have? And then how does each character leave the story? Do they get a scene of their own for that, or does it happen in a scene you've already listed? Things like, there's 7 basic emotions. Do you hit those 7 basic emotions throughout the story? If you don't, is there why? Like, for all of these, the question is, if you don't do it, why? If you have a reason, there's a reason that we never see what happens to that character. There's a reason that we don't do humor in this movie, whatever have you. But so it's all, do you have this? Because most of the time you'll need it. But if you don't have it, you have to have an explanation of why. And I make myself write the explanation. So, and it's like, okay, so do I have a scene that meets the Bechdel test? Do I have a scene that meets the reverse Bechdel test? Do I have one that meets the racial Bechdel test? And again, you don't have to have all of those in every movie, but most things should have those. And so I just have this list of, like, okay, make sure it's got to have this, it's got to have this, it's got to have this. And then I just put those together. How many of those are actually the same scene? And then I look, and I've got, I don't know, I have maybe 20 scenes laid out of 37. And then I have a series of really weird questions that I ask myself, or just sayings. Things that I've picked up from all sorts of places. And I've just created this list. and it's things like, it'll just be the word denser, or it'll say play with time, or repetition is a form of change, or what's the third option? And I have a list of, I think, about 40 of those. And so then what I do is I just, for the story I'm writing, I'm like, what would a scene be that I could describe as denser? Or what would be a scene where they choose a third option? And I do that. And then I'm like, okay, well, I need 17 more scenes. And I've got these 40. Here's the 15 that really stand out to me. Where should they go on the list between these things I already know I'm going to need? And then there'll be a couple empty scenes where I'm going to have to tie things together or what have you. So that's kind of my process. It's just list making, but it's kind of layered list making. And then once I have that list, I put it in the writing program. So for comics and for screenplays, that's Highland that I'm using right now.
Okay. Cool.
For prose, I do it in Pages. But so in Highland, I say I'm writing a screenplay. In Highland, I will put the list in. And each item on the list will be formatted as a scene heading. Nice. So if I look over in the navigation bar, I see all the scenes laid out. I'm that scene's going to have that, that scene's going to have that, this scene's going to have that. And sometimes I'll be writing scene 14 and I realize, I'm going to need to make sure I do something in scene 22 to pay off that thing I just wrote. And so then I just jump down to where scene 22 is and I write, pay this off,
Oh, that's cool.
So every time I get to a scene, I have at least one line telling me what's in that scene, but sometimes some further thoughts that have been kicked up by the rest of the script. And it also means I don't have to write them in order. I can skip around. I'm like, I do not know how to do this scene. So let me go 2 scenes forward and then see how do I work backwards? What do I need to do before that to make that happen? What do I need to do before that? But what's great about that is you only face the blank page once. The rest of it is expanding the same document over and over and over again until you have what you would call a script. Warren Ellis was just talking about this recently in his newsletter. He said, it's just layering. He's like, you just add layers on top of layers. And then he said what I think was really key. He's like, and every layer gets to be shit except the last one. And you get to decide which one is the last one.
That's awesome.
So it's just like, so sometimes you're just like, you know what, this is a crappy version of the scene, but I just need something here to hold these things together. I'll come back. I'll add another layer to it. But it's okay for this to be a shitty scene. I just,
Yeah. I love that. That's awesome. Actually, this is one of my favorite parts about having conversations with other storytellers is that we can pick up like things that we might want to try from each other, because as being the mechanic that I am, using your words, like once I found Sid Field's paradigm, I'm like, oh yeah, this is a great framework, right? Because basically what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, he's saying that as opposed to every page needs to get you to the next page, he's saying that every so often in the story, if the audience isn't encouraged to continue the story, they'll just drop out. And so I love breaking it down into a page by page approach, because then I actually had a writing professor in college who actually said that. He's like, every single page of your screenplay has to have something cool on it, or else what are you doing, So I do love that. So I tend to be, as a mechanic, I start with the paradigm, and I do that for novels, I do it for short films, I do it for I don't write a lot of comics, but for features, whatever. But one of the things that I'll do then is once I'm done, like kind of like putting the plot points, if you will, and various things on the paradigm, I almost will never look at it again unless I've lost my way in the whole story, and I'm like, what is this even about? And then I might go back to it. So it just gives me something to go, okay, if the character journey needs to look like this and the character needs to go through these emotions, and we're going to talk about that in some other videos that we're going to do, then the development of the character needs to go through these stages. And if I'm not at this stage by this time, then I need to figure out why. Why is that stage taking so long? Or is it not interesting enough and we need to get through that stage faster? So I actually think I'm going to take some of
sometimes your subconscious is telling you you're trying to take them in the wrong direction.
Exactly right.
I heard Mark Wade once say, he said, like, that's usually what writer's block is. Your subconscious knows there's a problem and you need to stop. and it's not going to let you
exactly.
move forward until you've solved this problem that you haven't consciously figured out it's there, but your story has something broken in it, you know?
Yeah, and that's actually going to be a good segue into my next question. But before that, to your point, a lot of times what will happen, at least maybe for mechanics more so than muses, is that a lot of times what I'll find happening is that once I've mapped it out, the characters do not want to go to the places I've mapped out. The characters have become fully realized, and as they're going through this thing, it's like, well, I can't force her to do that because she's not going to do that right now. So I've got to figure out another way to think through, like, well, is her journey still interesting? Is where she's at meaningful? And then go through all that process over again. But any kind of framework you use, there are sometimes where I feel like a character is just like, nope, I'm not, that's not what I would do in this scenario. And then you're like, okay, starting from scratch, you know?
Right.
That's it for today's show. Special thanks again to Caleb Monroe for joining me to talk about story structure. If you have any questions, leave them down below, and don't forget to hit that like button for me. In our next video, Caleb Monroe and I will be digging deeper into character development, how to do it, why it matters, all of the same sort of conversation that we had today. So be sure to subscribe and don't miss that video. If you want to listen to the entire conversation unedited that Caleb and I had about story structure, character development, character arcs, if you want to listen to all of it, go support us on Patreon, patreon.com/thestorygeeks. You can find the link to that down below. I'll see you on the next video.